A black woman is driving down a busy street when a police officer pulls her over. She calmly asks for help, but what happens next is unbelievable. The officer dismisses her request without a second thought, assuming she's just another civilian he can ignore. But what he doesn't know is that this woman is far more powerful than he could ever imagine. When she reveals her true identity, the officer's world comes crashing down. The woman is the mayor of the city. What happens next will leave you speechless as the power dynamic shifts completely. The sun was beginning to set on a busy city street as the black woman in her sleek car cruised along, heading toward an important meeting. She wasn't in a hurry, but she knew the evening would be demanding. Her car's quiet hum was interrupted by the flashing red and blue lights behind her. A police officer had pulled her over. She knew this wasn't an ordinary stop, but she had learned not to panic. Calmly, she pulled to the side of the road and rolled down her window, waiting for the officer's approach. The officer, a tall man with a hardened look, strolled up to her vehicle with a dismissive air. He glanced at her and then at her license plate before flashing a quick look at her through the window. He was already assessing her in his mind, assuming she was just another person he could handle quickly and move on from. "Afternoon, ma'am," the officer said. "Do you know why I stopped you?" "No, officer," she responded, maintaining her composure. "Is there a problem?" The officer, already annoyed with the interruption to his day, leaned in and gruffly said, "You were going a little too fast. I'm going to need you to step out of the car so I can check your ID." She raised an eyebrow but didn't hesitate. "I wasn't speeding," she said. "I've been following the speed limit, and I don't think there's any reason for me to step out of the car, officer." The officer's expression tightened. "Listen, ma'am, I'm not in the mood for this. Just get out of the car so I can check your papers. Don't make this harder than it has to be." The woman sat still, her gaze unwavering. She could feel the tension building, but her calm demeanor gave no hint of backing down. She knew something about this officer's behavior didn't feel right, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her. The woman's calmness seemed to unsettle the officer. His eyes narrowed as he continued to stare at her, clearly frustrated by her reluctance to comply. He took a step closer, raising his voice slightly, trying to assert his authority. "I said, step out of the car," he barked. But the woman remained unfazed, keeping her posture calm and poised. "Officer, I have not violated any traffic laws. I don't understand why you're asking me to step out of my car when there's no legitimate reason for it." The officer's jaw tightened, his patience wearing thin. "I'm not going to argue with you, ma'am. I've got things to do." He reached for the door handle, an action that would have felt threatening to most. But she didn't flinch. Instead, she stayed firmly in her seat, her gaze unwavering. "Are you sure you want to make this a bigger issue than it needs to be?" she asked, calmly, her voice even but tinged with a quiet authority that most people would have missed. The officer paused for a moment, perhaps registering the slight shift in her tone, but quickly shook it off. He leaned in toward the car window, his eyes scanning the interior as if looking for something to justify his aggression. His behavior was blatant now. This wasn't just a routine stop. This was something personal. His judgment of her based solely on her race had clouded his professional conduct. "I don't like your attitude, ma'am," he said, his words dripping with condescension. "You're making this harder for yourself. Just give me your ID so we can wrap this up." But the woman was no longer going to play along. She'd had enough. She knew what was happening. The officer was judging her based on assumptions, and she wasn't going to let him get away with it. "I'll give you my ID," she said, "but I need you to listen to me first." What's going on here isn't right. I'm not your typical stop-and-search subject, and I expect to be treated with respect." The officer, stunned by her directness, paused for a moment before reaching for his notepad. But before he could write anything down, the woman did something that would change everything. She reached into her purse and pulled out her phone. She dialed a number calmly and put the phone to her ear, still keeping the officer in her line of sight. "Hello? Yes, this is Mayor Jackson. I'm currently being harassed by one of your officers outside on Main Street," she said, her voice cool and collected. The officer's face immediately changed from one of frustration to confusion. He had assumed she was just another random civilian, someone he could dismiss without any consequences. But hearing her calmly state her identity knocked the wind out of his arrogance. You're the mayor," the officer stuttered, his previously confident tone faltering. "Yes, I am," she replied, still as calm as ever. "And I would like to understand why I'm being treated this way. I believe I'm entitled to the same respect as any other citizen, don't you think?" The officer was speechless for a moment. His face reddened as the realization of who he was dealing with set in. The moment had gone from routine to something far more serious. He quickly looked down at his shoes, realizing that his actions had been not only unprofessional, but potentially career-threatening. The woman hung up the phone, her gaze still fixed on the officer, who was now visibly uncomfortable. "I've had enough of this," she said, her voice steady. "I expect this to be handled immediately, and I'll be reporting this incident to the department." The officer's posture shifted. He had no words left. His earlier arrogance had evaporated into regret, and now he could only apologize, though his words felt hollow. I'm sorry, ma'am," he muttered. "I didn't know." "Obviously," the woman cut him off. "But that's not the point, is it? It's not about whether you know who I am, it's about how you treat people. You made assumptions about me based on my appearance, and you treated me like I was insignificant. That's not acceptable." The officer stood there, his mouth agape, unsure how to respond. His authority had been completely undermined, and it was clear that there were going to be consequences for his behavior. As the woman prepared to leave, she turned back toward the officer one last time. "I suggest you take a long look at your actions and think about how you treat people in the future," she said. "And I'll be reporting this incident to Internal Affairs. You'll hear from my office soon." The woman got back into her car, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She hadn't raised her voice or gotten angry, but her words had been powerful. Her authority wasn't based on threats or force. It was based on integrity and the quiet strength that came from knowing who she was. The officer stood frozen as she drove away, the realization of his mistake settling in. He had underestimated her, and now he had to face the consequences. The woman wasn't just a random person. She was the mayor, and he had disrespected her. There would be repercussions for that. The next morning, the city was buzzing with whispers about what had happened the day before. The mayor, an influential and respected figure in the community, had been harassed by one of the city's police officers, and it didn't take long for the story to spread. Elijah Jackson, a man known for his fair leadership and steady hand, had become the subject of local conversation, not because of his position, but because of the shocking way he had been treated by one of his own officers. Back at the police station, Officer Matthews knew he was in trouble. The realization that he had humiliated the mayor of the city, someone he had never imagined would be in a situation like this, hit him hard. What he hadn't understood in the moment was the weight of his actions, not just the violation of professional conduct, but the impact of his bias. He had assumed the woman asking for help was just another average citizen, someone easy to dismiss. But the moment her identity was revealed, his arrogance had collapsed, leaving him to face the consequences of his misjudgment. When Elijah arrived at the station later that day, he was greeted by a mix of officers who seemed uneasy, unsure of what was about to happen. The department had been on edge since the incident, knowing that their actions were now under scrutiny. The city's mayor wasn't just a political figure. He was the embodiment of the very community they had sworn to serve. Elijah's calm demeanor made it clear he was not there to escalate the situation unnecessarily. He had already made it clear to Officer Matthews that he was reporting the incident. But this was his moment to address the broader issue, the systemic problem of bias that still lingered within the police force. When he entered the station, his presence commanded respect. His steps were deliberate, his eyes calm but steady. He didn't walk in with anger, but with authority. He wasn't just the mayor anymore. He was a leader who was holding his community to a higher standard. The police chief, who had been following the story closely, met him at the front desk. "Mr. Jackson," he said with an uncomfortable tone, "I've been made aware of the situation, and we're already looking into it." "Good," Elijah replied, his voice calm but filled with purpose. "I'm here to make sure that this issue is addressed properly. We can't let incidents like this slide. We need to hold our officers accountable for their actions. No one, not even me, should be treated this way, and certainly not because of how they look or the assumptions people make about them." The chief nodded slowly, clearly aware of the seriousness of the situation. "I agree, sir. This is not how we expect our officers to behave. We will handle this appropriately." The tension in the room was palpable. The officers present were aware of the gravity of the moment. Officer Matthews had been summoned into the room, and he stood there, looking more uncomfortable than ever. His uniform suddenly felt like a burden. Elijah turned to him. "Officer Matthews," he said firmly, "you made a mistake yesterday. I'm sure that when you learned who I was, you realized just how far you crossed the line. But that's not enough. I need to understand why you thought it was acceptable to treat anyone this way." Matthews stood rigid, trying to find his words. I didn't mean to. I didn't know," he stammered, visibly shaken. "You didn't know," Elijah echoed. "What you didn't know was that you were standing in front of someone with the same rights as anyone else. But your behavior wasn't just disrespectful. It was a reminder that some people are still treated differently based on assumptions about who they are. The way you handled that situation wasn't just a personal mistake. It was a failure of the system." The room was silent, and Matthews seemed to shrink under Elijah's gaze. He had no defense, no excuses. The realization that he had been wrong, and deeply so, was hitting him hard. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Officer Matthews," Elijah continued, his voice softening, but still firm. "I'm here to make sure that no one else is treated this way. That's why we're going to make this an example. Your behavior will be reviewed by Internal Affairs, and from here on out, the department will undergo a full evaluation on bias and respect. If there's anything that goes against the values of this city, it needs to be addressed. And it starts here. With you." Elijah's words were measured but powerful. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even vindictive. He was simply ensuring that the community was better than this, that the people in charge were held accountable for their actions, and that the power dynamic was righted. The room was still, and Officer Matthews was left to face the consequences. He wasn't fired on the spot, but he would be placed under review. Internal Affairs would take a closer look at his history and his interactions with the public. This wouldn't just be a slap on the wrist. It would be a full examination of whether he was fit to serve in a role of authority. As Elijah stood up to leave, He turned to the police chief once again. "I expect changes," he said. "This is not about one officer. It's about creating an environment where everyone is treated fairly. I'll be monitoring this closely." The days that followed the confrontation were filled with intense scrutiny from both the media and the community. The mayor's calm yet firm handling of the situation sent shockwaves through the city. What initially seemed like a routine traffic stop had evolved into a pivotal moment for the entire police department. The public outcry was immediate. People rallied behind the mayor's leadership and applauded his decision to hold Officer Matthews accountable. But while the public supported him, Elijah Jackson knew the real work had only just begun. The internal investigation into Officer Matthews' conduct was swift. The officer's previous record revealed a troubling pattern of unprofessional behavior toward citizens, especially toward people of color. It became clear that his treatment of the mayor wasn't a one-off mistake. It was part of a broader issue within the department. But the real twist came when the investigation uncovered a series of complaints filed against Matthews that had been ignored or dismissed by his superiors. It wasn't just Matthews who was responsible for the discrimination. It was a systemic issue within the department itself. The findings were so damning that they couldn't be ignored. The city had to face the uncomfortable truth that racism and bias had infiltrated their own law enforcement. The pressure was now on the city to address the issue head-on. The mayor's actions had sparked a much-needed conversation about racism in the police force, and now the city was forced to take accountability. The investigation revealed that several officers had been involved in similar incidents, often dismissed or overlooked due to their rank, tenure, or connections. The officers who had turned a blind eye to Matthews' behavior now found themselves under investigation as well. Elijah Jackson knew the stakes were high. As the mayor, he had the power to make significant changes, but he also knew how challenging it would be to implement them. This wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about a system that allowed discrimination to fester unchecked. The revelation about the systemic nature of the problem was both shocking and sobering for everyone involved. The community, now aware of how deep the issue ran, demanded change, and fast. The media frenzy surrounding the incident continued, and it didn't take long for the national spotlight to turn on Elijah Jackson. As the story of the mayor being disrespected by a police officer went viral, people across the country started speaking out, sharing their own experiences with police misconduct. The conversation about racial bias in law enforcement, especially toward black individuals, took center stage in a way it hadn't before. But for Elijah, the spotlight wasn't what mattered. He wasn't in this fight for personal gain or recognition. He was in it because he knew this was an opportunity to spark real change for the future. He saw the attention as a catalyst for progress, not just for the city, but for every city grappling with similar issues. This was bigger than one officer. It was about reforming the system itself. Meanwhile, Officer Matthews, who had once been defiant, found himself isolated as the investigation continued. His apology had come too late, and his previous behavior was now under intense scrutiny. While he was placed on administrative leave pending the investigation, the pressure from the public and the media was mounting. His reputation was in shambles, and his career seemed to be hanging by a thread. Despite the serious nature of the situation, Elijah remained level-headed. He knew that the road to reform wouldn't be easy, and he wasn't going to allow this incident to be brushed under the rug. He called for immediate policy changes and a complete overhaul of the way the police department was trained. The city needed new leadership in its law enforcement, leadership that would promote fairness and hold officers accountable for their actions. and the mayor was ready to make sure that happened. Over the next few weeks, the city council, with Elijah's support, passed new legislation aimed at addressing racial bias and inequality within the police force. The reforms included mandatory anti-bias training, improved community police relations programs, and a new independent oversight committee to handle complaints of misconduct. The city also began to review all previous complaints about officers that had been ignored or dismissed, vowing to hold those responsible accountable. The ripple effect of this incident extended beyond just the police department. The mayor's actions set a powerful example for the community and for other leaders around the country. People were paying attention to the changes in the city, and many were looking to Elijah Jackson as a role model for what it meant to fight for justice, no matter the cost. As the investigation into Officer Matthews and the police department continued, the mayor's office worked tirelessly to ensure that the reforms they were implementing were more than just symbolic gestures. Elijah knew that the work ahead would take time, but he was determined to make a difference. His quiet yet firm leadership had exposed a system of injustice, but it also laid the groundwork for a better, more inclusive future. As the dust settled and the investigation came to a close, Officer Matthews was officially terminated from the police force. His actions, both on the day of the traffic stop and in the broader context of his career, had proven to be incompatible with the values the city was striving to uphold. The mayor, while satisfied with the outcome, knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The true test would be in ensuring that the changes made would be lasting. The story of the mayor and the officer who had underestimated him became a lesson in humility and respect. It showed that no one, not even someone in a position of power, should ever be treated as less than human based on assumptions or prejudice. The mayor's quiet strength and determination had forced the city to look at itself and recognize that true justice required more than just words. It required action. The city slowly began to heal from the fallout of the incident. Elijah Jackson's leadership not only exposed the glaring issues within the police force, but also initiated a crucial dialogue about racial bias, prejudice, and accountability. What started as an unfortunate incident turned into a turning point, both for the police department and the community as a whole. In the weeks that followed, the reforms that Elijah pushed for started to take shape. The new anti-bias training for officers was rolled out, and community outreach programs were expanded, allowing citizens to directly engage with the law enforcement in an effort to rebuild trust. It was clear that these reforms were not a quick fix, but a long-term commitment to changing the culture of the police force. The goal wasn't just to punish the wrongdoers, but to ensure that such behavior could never happen again. The incident also served as a stark reminder of how important it is for people in positions of power to be held accountable. The police officer, who once held a position of authority over everyday citizens, had assumed he could treat anyone however he liked. But in the face of the mayor's unyielding calm and moral authority, he realized his abuse of power would no longer go unnoticed or unchallenged. His career was forever altered, and the city would be forced to confront its own failings. In his quiet way, Elijah had made sure of that. He didn't need to yell. He didn't need to play to the crowd. He simply needed to stand firm in his values. His composure under pressure wasn't just a reflection of his character. It was a lesson in leadership. Elijah's father, a longtime mentor to him, had often told him, "True power comes from respect, not fear." His calm handling of the situation was a testament to that wisdom. He didn't need to raise his voice to get his point across. His actions spoke louder than anything else could. While the public focused on the immediate consequences for Officer Matthews, Elijah was looking ahead, ensuring that the changes being put in place were sustainable. He met regularly with the police chief to ensure that reforms were being implemented and that the department was taking its biases seriously. Elijah also began working with advocacy groups to create a more inclusive city culture, one where people from all backgrounds could feel safe, respected, and heard. The mayor was no longer just a figurehead of the city. He was a symbol of progress and justice. But for Elijah, the victory wasn't about the officer's downfall or the media frenzy. It was about the long-term impact on the community. The real success lay in the way the city came together to demand change, and how those in positions of power were now forced to confront their actions and attitudes. The incident served as a turning point for law enforcement and for Elijah himself, who understood that leadership wasn't just about making the right decisions in the moment. It was about shaping the future. The community, too, began to reflect on its own role in this situation. There were those who had stood by and let bias run unchecked for far too long. Some citizens had watched the mayor's treatment with indifference or dismissed it as just another isolated incident. But now, they were aware that this wasn't just about one officer's actions. It was a reflection of deeper issues that needed to be addressed, not only within the police department, but throughout society. In the end, it was a lesson in humility for everyone involved. The officer who had underestimated the woman in front of him had to confront the fact that his assumptions were wrong, not just in a personal way, but in a way that affected everyone around him. His actions, though now being addressed, had already exposed the fractures in the system that allowed prejudice to thrive unchecked. The mayor's response, on the other hand, was a masterclass in dignity, leadership, and resilience. Elijah Jackson wasn't just mayor of the city, he was a champion for justice. His actions had shown that true leadership didn't come from power or influence alone. It came from integrity, accountability, and a commitment to creating a better world for everyone. His leadership was now marked by the understanding that standing up for the rights of one was standing up for the rights of all. And he would continue to push for fairness, understanding that real change requires time, patience, and the willingness to never back down when injustice rears its head. As for Officer Matthews, his fall from grace was a painful reminder that those in positions of authority must never forget their duty to serve, respect, and protect. His career was never going to be the same again. He would have to live with the consequences of his actions, facing a long process of reflection and accountability. The mayor had turned the tide not through power, but through quiet, unshakable leadership. In doing so, he had shown the entire city what it meant to stand for what's right, regardless of the cost. The moral of this story is clear. Authority must always be tempered with fairness and respect. Bias, no matter how subtle or ingrained, can never be allowed to go unchecked. Those in power must be held accountable for their actions, and sometimes the biggest changes come not through force, but through a steady and unwavering commitment to doing what's right. Elijah Jackson's handling of this situation didn't just change the course of his career, it changed the culture of an entire city. His leadership, rooted in dignity and respect, forced the community to confront its biases and demand accountability. The reforms that followed ensured that the actions of one officer would not define the entire police force. Instead, the story became one of growth, change, and a commitment to fairness for everyone. But the fight doesn't end here. It's up to all of us to stand up against injustice, to call out discriminatory behavior when we see it, and to create a world where respect is given to everyone, regardless of their race, background, or position. If this story inspired you, it's time to think about how you can make a difference in your community. How can we stand together to challenge systemic biases and create a more just world? Have you ever had to stand up for what's right, even when it felt uncomfortable? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. Together, we can make sure that every voice is heard and respected. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more inspiring stories of leadership, justice, and standing up against inequality. We believe that every person, no matter their background, deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Thanks for watching, and stay tuned for more stories that challenge the status quo and inspire change.